So Farad, we're here today to be talking about a hot topic in the industry, which is measurement and evaluation. What's happening right now that brands need to be thinking about?
Okay, so I think there are probably 3 or 4 main things that are going on at sort of different levels of pace, really, that brands need to actually already have done something about in some instances, but also need to be considering looking at what they're doing forwards. I think the first one that's really hit is the changes to Facebook, or I should say Meta, and the conversion, particularly the conversion tracking element, where the changes that Apple have made, particularly to iOS 14 and 15, have significantly restricted the amount of data that Facebook can pass back. So there are workarounds around this that help preserve that a little bit, like Conversions API, but you really need to start thinking about measurement within a channel environment in Facebook in a slightly different way, in what success looks like. And the reality is you can no longer be so literal about ascribing data to causation in the way that's happened historically. The second one is probably more of a slow burn, but will end up being a big burn in about a year's time, which is the changes to privacy that are happening across the industry. So the main thing that's been happening for a while, and it's really been affecting everyone, is actually increasing platforms have been blocking third-party cookies for quite a while. The idea that your analytics or any other third-party based platform has been correctly tracking and attributing your online sales data has been kind of 20% out for most people for quite some time. That trend is getting worse because of what's happening from a privacy and cookie blocking point of view. But Google's announcement that Chrome will now block third-party cookies from I think it's October next year, but also the fundamental changes to Google Analytics, which is really going to take away that ability to ascribe, again, individual transaction data to a bunch of sessions and a correlation to a much more of a modeled future because of the amounts of data missing, is the thing that people need to be looking at. As part of that story, you really have to look at the interrelationship between Google Analytics and Google if you use it as an ad platform. So that's looking at things like enhanced conversions and consent mode to really try and improve the amount of data that Google's actually going to be able to see. But also get used to the fact that in the new world of the way that we look at data, it is going to be based on statistical sampling, modeling, and understanding the patterns and relationships between user behavior, not a linear kind of causation type behavior. That's going to prove a challenge because it's really fundamentally going to change the way that data looks. For those who haven't already started setting up GA4 in parallel, I would suggest they do. The way data looks in GA4 is very different to what you're used to, and there's going to take a bit of time to get the balances out. The third piece that's kind of there, that's being talked about a little bit less, but is kind of still quite important and really does affect things like social and programmatic, is a lot of the audience data that you use for your buying, interest this, I viewed that, retargeting, is all based on third-party pixels, right? So almost all of that infrastructure is going to disappear. So you will need to think about social in terms of interest data that Facebook has been gleaning from third-party platforms will mean that their audiences will shrink. You need to think about more data that you can bring into that, whether that be third-party plugins or actually really increasing the volume of first-party data. Programmatic, well, that really won't work at all. From a conversion point of view, there is no real solution that I've seen yet that I think will solve that problem. There are lots of things around ID identifiers that will help you match bits of data. But again, the ability to build audiences in the way that you have done will go away. It will definitely become more site-driven, contextual. So you've got these parallel challenges, and the ones that we're talking about more and more about at the moment are about how do I track stuff? How do I measure stuff? But the piece that's coming increasingly is actually going to be how do I target stuff? How do I find the right audiences to go to the right places? And we've got, a year or so of these 4 or 5 things all going in sync at different places on different platforms in different ways.
So it's going to get a lot harder, essentially.
Yeah, it is. I think that we've become generally quite familiar with using a single platform such as GA as almost the source of truth, and actually then having variables around programmatic because it tracks slightly differently to understand what methodology for that is, and for social, what does that mean from a channel data point of view, and this kind of view of 2 or 3 different things, but using this baseline of data. We're going to have to recalibrate how we choose to interpret data, what it actually means. And for me, that's actually a good thing, because the idea that Google Analytics was ever a true source of what really happens on a website is nonsense. It always has been nonsense. It is not a marketing analytics tool. it's a user analytics tool. And they're two very, very different things. So I think there's a real opportunity for the people that can understand the change and also do the experimentation and the learning in parallel, new data, old data, help you understand the transition and translation. You are likely to have an opportunity to improve faster than some of your peers. That, you know, there's been a thing, I think, for 20 odd years where a lot of this stuff has been the same sort of methodology that everybody's ended up using with little variation. The quicker you learn this bit and your competitors don't, the more likely you are to understand how you can really impact what your business is doing from a digital point of view faster than anybody else.
And I think that's what we're seeing right now. We've got some brands who are inquisitive, embracing this change, acting on it, and others that not necessarily refusing to, but perhaps sleepwalking a bit into this problem.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. But I think that part of the consequence of this data change, it's not just a marketing problem. You have got, and I enjoy myself when I have these arguments, you know, a lot of the way that finance teams have been trained to interpret marketing data is through Google Analytics. And so actually you're not talking about just trying to change a framework of how a marketing team actually works, but actually data that the business is relying on all the way through the organization, from finance to the CEO to whoever. And you've got to change all of those guys' ability to look at data in different ways simultaneously, where their level of knowledge is actually very fragmented, or what they look at is very specific within quite a tight context. So that's where I think, I don't think people are, from the marketing teams we're talking with, sleepwalking. I think that the sort of pace that we're seeing become a bit slower in some of those areas is complexity of the businesses and how many layers of how many different things you need to get changed through that you then need to think about, which obviously takes a bit more time, right?
Yeah. So actually, we've got 18 months or so until brands need to be working in a whole new model, right?
We have, but you know, most people want to be able to do some comparative analysis of data, you know, year-on-year stuff. So depending on when your financial year happens to begin or end, there is a point at which you need to kind of go, well, if my financial year begins in July and I want to be able to do year-on-year comparative data in the future, I have to have a working GA4 setup that gets me, you know, to 80-90% data relevancy by July, because otherwise that view of the world I want to look at will just not make any sense.
Brilliant. Thanks for that overview. And obviously we're here to help this conversation.
We are, and you know, I think that we're here to help those conversations, but they're not just the technology conversations or the implementation conversations or the setup conversations, because all those things are slightly different businesses. I think it's also the help you interpret and figure out how this business not just works for your marketing teams, but how we need to then translate that or give you different stuff to actually work and empower the other teams, which is why I think too many people have treated it as we need to do this within this marketing confine bit, which is, from being honest, I don't think some of that structural stuff is that difficult. It's actually the wider, how do you change and train people to understand data differently and what it really means in this context compared to what you used to look at before. So that's the bigger bit. I think that you know, we can definitely give clients a lot more help with across that process.
Great. Well, thanks for your time, Farah.
You're welcome.